Sisters and brothers, it's a great blessing for me to be here in your church this morning and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. I apologize, I cannot preach in Korean. My Korean is very small. I can understand a little bit, but I cannot speak or preach. And I'm very grateful for Isingu Moksanim and your hospitality here that I experience. It's a wonderful blessing to be sisters and brothers around the world. The topic of my sermon today is called The Way of Christ. And we read this morning the passage from the Gospel of Mark. And this is approximately the middle of the Gospel. So Jesus already experienced some time with the disciples, and now he tells them what lies ahead of him. And that is not a pleasant news. It's Jesus talks about suffering, and he talks about rejection, and disciples realize that he will be crucified and die on the cross. And it's a very difficult time. You know, when you know that you have very limited time in this life, you want to tell something that is very important. And so Jesus, he has a very limited time now with disciples, and he wants to tell them what is some of the most important things for their lives. And he tells them about what does it mean to follow Christ. What does it mean to go on the way of Christ, to be a disciple. And so when he tells this to his disciples, it's a very difficult for them to accept. And there's a slide with a picture of Rembrandt van Rijn. If you visit Russia, I recommend to come to St. Petersburg. It's the former capital of Russia before revolution, before 1917. And it has a huge museum. It's called Hermitage Museum. Used to be the palace of our Tsar. And now it's all, full of art and pictures from all over the world. And so this is one of the famous pictures by Rembrandt where depicted the taking off from Jesus' body from the cross. And if you look closely, you can find it on the internet. If you look closely, you see some people are crying, some people are fainting because they cannot just, receive this suffering of Jesus. Some people are just depressed, and it's a very difficult time, very tragic time for many who follow Jesus now realize that he is crucified and died on the cross. So this chapter in the Gospel of Mark is one of the most crucial. That, the evangelist Mark shows this culmination of Jesus' ministry, that he talks about suffering, and he now starts his way to the cross, and that's the way of Jesus. And when disciples hear this from Jesus, for them it's now a decisive moment, whether to follow Christ or maybe it's too dangerous to follow Christ. It's like Shakespeare's Hamlet book, the famous line that says, to be or not to be. And for disciples here now, it's to be with Christ and follow his suffering and rejection of this world, or not to be, and maybe have life in my own comfort. And this is a very decisive moment. The way of Christ is the way of suffering and the way of the cross. And each person who follows Christ in this way can face rejection or hostility or suffering or even death. Even today in our 21st century, we know sometimes in some places like Afghanistan, for example, people can die because they are followers of Christ. In my country, people can be fined or sometimes taken to prison if they break certain laws about religious freedom. We have some restrictions on how to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in places like Kazakhstan, for example, also there are some restrictions. And if people are Methodists or Protestants, a lot of people criticize them because they say, oh, you are now some kind of strange Christian. You are not, like traditional Christian. or you are not a Muslim like many people in those places. And so people can be very hostile and reject you because you are a Christian. And so Jesus gave us his example, that he sacrifices himself for others, and so that others can be saved. I want to share a story with you this morning. It's a story about Pastor Kim Yong-hak. Here is the picture of him. If you visit Vladivostok, Russia, Vladivostok is in the Far East. It's actually not very far from Seoul, Korea. It's only a 90-minute flight from Seoul to Vladivostok. And we have a state archive there. So I visited this archive and I looked through some documents of 100 years ago, 1920 approximately. And so I found many interesting documents, and some of these documents are here. One of the documents, they have the names of the members of the church. At that time, you know, the communists, they came to power in 1917. We had a revolution. And after that, they controlled all the church activities. So they required the names of the members. So some of the names are in Korean and in Russian in those documents. You can read them. And also, at that time, Pastor Kim Yong-hak, he was a missionary from Korea in Vladivostok, Russia. And when the communists came in 1920s, 1930, they said, now it's time to restrict this religious freedom. And so they closed some of the churches, and some of the churches were very controlled. And so they told Pastor Kim Yong-hak, you need to go back to Korea. But going back to Korea, you remember the history that it was occupied by Japan at that time. So it's a difficult choice. You know, you go back to Korea, which is occupied by foreign rulers, or you stay in Russia, but it's dangerous because if you are Christian, you can be put in prison. And so he had a family, small children, and many of the members of the church, they went back to Korea, and then they told him also, Kim Oksanim, it's safer to go back to Korea because you have family, you have children. This is too dangerous to stay in Vladivostok. But he said, I will not go back. He said, if my people stay here, only one person from the Methodist Church stays here in Vladivostok, I will stay also. Because these are my sheep and I am their shepherd. I am their pastor. And so he decided to stay. But we know the story is it's a very tragic story, that after some time he got arrested and he was sent to Gulag. Gulag is like a concentration camp. It's a very harsh place to live. If you read some of the books from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he describes the tough life in camp, in labor camps. And so he was put in those camps, and after several years, you know, he wrote letters to his wife, and some of those slides, they show on the left, no, if you go back, the previous slide, yeah, on the left, you can see the letter from Pastor Kim to his wife, who was in Korea at that time. And he would describe his life in that camp. And after some years, he died in that camp because it was such a harsh life and a lot of suffering. And he was one of the martyrs of Christian faith in our land, in Russia, in the Far East. And so when I studied that material, you know, it really brought a lot of memories from my own family. And I want to share briefly about my family. This is my grandmother. My grandparents, they immigrated to Russia end of 19th century. So my grandmother in this picture, she was born in Vladivostok area in 1904. And she had 8 children, including my mother. And so when they lived in Far East in Russia in beginning of 20th century, they had a good life. But then in 1937, you know, we had Joseph Stalin was our leader in the country. So he decided to deport all Koreans from Far East Russia to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. I was born in Kazakhstan. So my grandmother, she was 33 years old at that time. And she was pregnant. So she had 4 children already, small kids, and she was pregnant. And on that, they put them on the train like in one day. They put them on the train, and it was not very comfortable train. It was train for like moving goods and animals. They put a lot of people on the train. So like in one car, in one wagon, there could be like 40, 50 people. And they would travel maybe for almost 2 weeks because it was a slow train, go from Far East Russia to Kazakhstan. And many people died on that train. So my grandmother, she gave birth to my aunt, who actually was born, and for many years, it was like a funny and tragic story at the same time, because my aunt, for many years, she did not have a place of birth in her passport, because nobody knew where she was born. So they just decided, okay, we decide this place, so we put it in the passport. But in reality, they don't know, because the train was, moving, and they did not know, they did not speak good Russian language. But many people died on that train. Many children died on that train. It was a very tragic time of our history. My ancestors, they told the story that sometimes when somebody died, they couldn't bury the person. So they just covered that person with some grass and some other wheat, and they would throw it out from the train while it was moving. So it was a very tragic part of our history. So when I think about, Kim Yong-hak pastor and my family and many Korean people who suffered around the world, I can't help but to reflect, what does it mean for us today to follow Jesus Christ? What does it mean for us today that Jesus chose suffering for us so that we can be saved? I realize that I have my life today because my ancestors survived and they went through all the struggle. I have my Christian faith today because a missionary from your country came to Russia, and it was a difficult time. In 1992, our stores were empty. You cannot buy anything. Inflation was going up every day. So they came to Russia and shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with us, sacrificing their comfortable life and their time. And so I reflect about, all of this, and I think about myself, what kind of sufferings or challenges I have today as a Christian. Personally, I never experienced war, or I never experienced hunger or persecution, or I was never in prison. I never experienced anything like apostles did. And yet I think our generation today, as we live in America or in Russia, in Korea, I think we have other challenges, like temptations sometimes. For example, like materialism. As I see, American economy is growing, and Korea and in Russia, people get more comfortable life, but there is more temptation now, that people want to have more material things. They have one car, they want a bigger car. They have one house, they want a bigger house, because my neighbors get a bigger house and my neighbors get a bigger car. I want to have all of that. And the younger generation, it's like a culture of me in the center. It's my life, my wish, my desire, my ambition. I want everything for me. And that's a challenge of our time today. How can we today be a disciple of Jesus Christ and have a sacrificial life? When I look at this passage, sisters and brothers, it starts with Jesus telling the disciples about his way of the cross. And Peter, Apostle Peter, he always described as an emotional man. He doesn't want this to happen to Jesus. And he says, no, Jesus, you don't need to go to suffer. I want you to stay here. And that's a natural reaction. If my family member, if my wife would say, I'm going to suffer, Of course, I would say, no, 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 don't go there. Stay here. I don't want my family to suffer. But Jesus, he tells this very tough words to Peter. He says, you remember? He says, go away from me, Satan, because you think not what of God's concern, but of the human concern. And that's a big difference, sisters and brothers. Because when we think about, maybe our children, of course we want to have everything best for them. But sometimes we spoil them because we think about human concerns and not God's concerns. But the main question is, what does God expect from us? What does God want in our life? And Jesus uses this moment with Peter and the apostles to tell them about the cost of discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple? I want to tell you also about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you move to the next slide. He was a pastor in Germany during World War II. Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, they were very powerful and they had a strong army. They conquered most of the Europe and also invaded Russia. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor at that time. And so even some churches at that time, Christian pastors and churches, they said, oh, Adolf Hitler is like a Messiah. We want to pray and bless him and support him. But of course, true Christians, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they said, no, no, no. Adolf Hitler, it's evil. Nazi party is evil because they want to elevate their own race and they want to eliminate other people, other nations and ethnic groups like Jews and Gypsies and others. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was very active against Adolf Hitler. And so he was taken to concentration camp. He was arrested and put concentration camp. And he died just a few weeks before the end of the war. And so, this is a story that really inspires me about his life, because he really, for me, an example of what does it mean when Jesus says three things. Deny yourself. If you want to be my disciple, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And so let's look at these verses a little more closely. What does it mean, deny yourself? When I hear these words, I don't feel comfortable because I have my own plans, I have my own dreams, I have my ambitions and, my priorities. But now Jesus says, deny everything. This is difficult for me. I want to control my life. I want to decide for myself. But, that's a challenging part for us. But, sometimes our head and our heart is already filled with a lot of prejudices and convictions. And so because of that, we cannot accept God's will. But, it's like we have the ears, but we cannot hear God. We may have the eyes, but we cannot see God because we put our things first before God's will. And that's why Jesus says, if you want to follow the way of Christ, you must first deny yourself. Deny your own agenda, your wishes, but it's not easy. Trust me, sisters and brothers. I know it might be difficult for you even today, because some people will cry if they deny themselves. Others maybe will have to put away, set aside their pride and their vanity. Maybe some people who are rich, they will have to stop relying on their money and their bank accounts. But, sisters and brothers, when we deny ourselves, we let God live in our hearts and transform us in God's holy image. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for me, is a great example because he realized it. He shared that only when we, come before God, fully deny our own desires to become somebody or to have our own agenda, to be successful or anything that we dream about, when we put everything before God, only when we give ourselves to God in God's hands, then we can truly become human and truly Christian. And this is a wonderful story, because Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself, he was truly faithful Christian, denying himself, but being faithful to God in the time of war and in the time of death. This is a great example. You know, I also experienced that to some degree in my life when I was growing up in the Soviet Union. We had a Cold War time at that time, and so I studied hydraulic engineering for weapons, like nuclear missiles. I studied American nuclear missiles and airplanes and tanks, and we had a special training in my school, and our colonel would say, "You are Soviet engineers, you need to build better weapons." And so I had this dream that I would build great weapons, I will protect my country, I will become rich and and have a comfortable life. But I had this dream until I came to United Methodist Church in Moscow, when I met wonderful people, and I met a missionary, Korean American missionary from U.S. His name is Jonathan Park. He now serves in San Diego, California. And I realized that now if I want to follow Christ, everything I have is not, it's not my life anymore. It's God's life. Even though I have a dream, but what is God's dream for me? And so my life was completely turned around. But I'm very grateful to God, because today I can use my skills and gifts not for the weapons, but for the gospel of Jesus Christ, sisters and brothers. And so Jesus is calling us today, deny yourself. The second part, he says, is take up your cross. What does it mean to take up your cross? We don't see people carrying the cross today, but in the time of Jesus, if you lived in the Roman Empire under Roman occupation, if you see a person carrying the cross, it means that they are going to be crucified. It means probably that this person committed a crime, and the Roman Empire, they were very sophisticated to punish people. So they invented this crucifixion. It's a very, it's a suffering death. It's not just quick death. It's a suffering death. And so Jesus says, take up your cross, and that means, Jesus expects us to follow and be faithful to him until the last breath of our life. Whatever we are today, doctors or teachers or, businessmen or pastors, Jesus expects us to be faithful to him until our last breath. Because being disciples is not just a hobby. We do sometimes, and then if we don't want, we don't do. It's not a game, like if we take only pleasure, then we can play this game. But if we don't take pleasure, forget about this. No, being disciple means that we are faithful to God every day until the last day. And so, in Russian language, sometimes we sometimes use the phrase, take up your cross very strangely. Sometimes people say, my wife is very quarrelsome. She brings quarrel all the time. That's my cross, okay? Or people say, my husband drinks too much alcohol. Oh, that's my cross, But that has nothing to do with what Jesus says in the gospel. Jesus expects us to be faithful to him every day of our lives until the last breath. And so, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, again, his story is very inspirational to me. He carried this cross until the last day. He says the following thing. In one of his books, he writes, the cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering which every man must experience is the call to abandon the attachments to this world. It is the dying of the old man, which is the result of his encounter with Christ. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give over our lives to death. Thus it begins. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And you know, there was an English officer in the prison together with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he saw Dietrich Bonhoeffer very often. And he described also that when he saw Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his face was radiating with light in the time of darkness. And he exemplified humility and gentleness. He was a man for whom God was very near, very close. And that's very amazing story to me, sisters and brothers. So what does it mean to deny yourself and to carry the cross and to be ready to die for Jesus Christ? You know, in the time of communism in the Soviet Union, when I was growing up, they told a story about many communists, and many of them were ready to die for the idea, for the communist idea. And they did. They put their lives on line. And so I'm thinking, you know, if communists can die for their idea, what about us as Christians, disciples? We live today in this modern world. What does it mean for us to deny yourself and to carry the cross? And the last thing Jesus says, the third part, he says, follow me. Follow me. You know, this is also a very interesting word because being disciple today is very different. You know, usually if you come to the school or to university, what do? You take your notebook, you take your pen, and you listen to the professor, and you write some notes, right? And then at the end of the semester, you pass the exam. But in Jesus' time, there were no schools, no university, no pen or paper even. So what does it mean to be a disciple? It means you follow your teacher. So if the teacher walks along the Sea of Galilee, the disciples go with him. If Jesus sits down and cooks meal, then all the disciples sit down together and cook meal together. If Jesus goes to the prayer mountain, all disciples go with him to the prayer mountain. So they actually followed the teacher every day, and they try to imitate. You know, if you know, some of you who raise children, you have that experience when you can tell children everything you want, but they will only do the things that you do yourself, right? If you don't do it, they will not do it. But so they imitate everything we do. And if they, you know, we live with them every day. And so because we experience that every day, they can imitate us every day. And then when they grow up, sometimes people say they're just like your copy because they live with you, they imitate your lifestyle. And so Jesus says, follow me. It means, you know, imitate my life. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he says, you know, that life of being disciple in Christ is not a quick victory, but it's an everyday practice. Everyday practice. It's like in many areas of our lives, whether it's, for example, eating. You know, if we eat healthy, we need to eat healthy every day. If we eat healthy every day, then we'll have a better chance to have a fruitful life, right? Exercising also. If we exercise every day or almost every day, we'll have a better shape, you know, it'll feel better. But if we do it only like once a year, it's not going to help. If we do it only once a month, that's not very good help. But same thing with the following Christ. If we follow Christ every day, not a quick victory, but everyday practice, then we are living the life of a disciple. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer said these words. He said, not hero worship, but intimacy with Christ, which means we don't want to be heroic, you know, like I want to, you know, this pray now for 2 days and then stop praying for 2 months. That's not what Jesus expects from us. Jesus expects us to have a regular Christian disciple life every day. Intimacy with Christ, relationship, close relationship with Christ. And so in conclusion, sisters and brothers, I want to say that when Christ calls you, he expects you to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus Christ. So let us go boldly on the way of Christ. Let us partner in mission together around the world and lose ourselves for the sake of Christ. It is a joy to be disciple and to share the good news with those who need encouragement. The way of Christ means losing yourself for Christ and for the gospel. The way of Christ means deny yourself every day and let Jesus reign in your heart, mind, and soul. The way of Christ means taking up your cross every day, even in face of hostility and rejection. The way of Christ means following Jesus wherever he leads you, out of your comfort zone. The way of Christ also means joy when you see sinner repenting and entering the family of God. The way of Christ also means hope when you hold the hand of your dying friend. The way of Christ also means friendship when you celebrate transformation of life with your sisters and brothers in the church. And the way of Christ also means victory when you are weak, but God is strong. So sisters and brothers, we are the followers of Christ going into the world with one mission, to share the love of God and the way of Christ, so that everyone can have the opportunity to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow Jesus Christ. So may God bless you as you follow Christ every day. Amen.